topic is actually something I wanted to talk about for a while now, but time and boredom weren't on my side until relatively recently, but now I have sufficient time and am sufficiently bored to talk about a thing that slightly irritates me, death of the author. Now, let me explain it for those normal people who never studied this stuff. Death of the author is a literary theory and one of the main ideas behind post-structuralism, which was first described in an essay of the same name written by Roland Barthes. The key thesis of that text is that the author's intent or biography is not the definitive way to interpret a text, as author's intent only exists within his own mind and not within the text itself, rendering it ultimately meaningless in the act of reading, interpreting, and critiquing the work. The author, and to an extent the critic, are Gnostic Samael, a false god that has to be dethroned by the reader, as reader's personal interpretation of the text is much more valuable than what the guy who wrote it meant, and those will often not lie between the reader and the author, or even between different readers, rendering the search of the meaning behind the work pointless, as it simply doesn't exist. The theory is but one of few ways postmodernist authors tried to distance themselves from the old ways of discerning the meaning of the work from both the text itself and the biography and personality of the author, claiming that the consumer has just as much, if not more, role in shaping the text as the writer himself. And that's fine. Not a lot of people these days would wholeheartedly argue that the popular opinion on the work doesn't shape our understanding of it. My biggest problem is how a lot of people use death of the author and reader's response theory as basically a way to stop or hinder any sort of discussion. And that's hard to really blame them for using it this way. I mean, saying that no interpretation of the text is necessarily correct is the intended goal here, but for the most part it was intended as a way for big-brained literary critics and philosophers to state their understanding of the work without being tarred and feathered by their peers. In a more casual environment, where people generally don't think as much about the meaning beyond the most baseline interpretation, using death of the author, or pretty much any theory regarding authorial intent, is just a very smart way of saying fuck you, I'm right, without having to show any proof for that. And in a fan environment, where having a dogmatic way of interpreting a work of art is important for internal cohesion of the community, it just comes out as unnecessarily divisive and, once again, a way of showing your superiority while denouncing those who disagree with you as biased and unhinged. And people also try using similar reasonings for games as well, like in this gem of a comment section. The context of the post is that there's this kickstarted game that is basically about humans isekai into a fantasy world in a body of a local fantasy race. The character they are discussing is Naida, an American Muslim army veteran who lost her legs in Afghanistan and was remade into a dwarf in a wheelchair, and how wheelchairs aren't supposed to be that big of a deal when role-playing a character because, and I quote, player tells GM how to handle it and GM does that. See, even though it is true that in the end of the day consumers' enjoyment of the product trumps everything else, the key issue here is that you're making a game. Games aren't just a way to tell a story, they're also mechanical in their nature. They require rules, for rules give limitations, and working within limitations, be it for narrative or mechanical reasons, is the main source of fun, unless you're one of those people who never had the patience to sit through a movie without it exploding in your face every 2 minutes. Because games are mechanical, everything has to have some sort of meaning. Yes, even power fantasy, as justification for it, is the main source of enjoyment. When the wheelchair doesn't have any sort of weight, and neither the story or the player's interaction with the world, why even bother with it in the first place? Why not indeed just replace it with a flying disc that would not only make movement easier, but also unlock some additional options you don't have? Sure, wheelchair acrobatics is fun the first 3 or 4 times, but then it gets mundane and never gets brought up again, turning your unique snowflake into just another piece of meat into the cold, uncaring machine that is the GM's narrative. Well, you can always just house rule something, and if anyone, especially creators of the game, disagree with you, death of the author, my dear! Death of the author.